Hey all! Today we're going to talk about one of the most important and one of the most misunderstood pieces of Final Fantasy XIV's cosmology. Reflections, rejoinings, and what they may mean for the story going forward. Now most players know the basic version. There is the source, and there are 13 reflected shards of the unsundered world. But that simple explanation leaves out the part that matters most. The reflections are not just alternate planets somewhere else in space. They are sundered versions of the same star, separated by a dimensional barrier, and still capable of being destroyed, merged, traversed, or drawn back together. So this video is going to quickly hit the foundations, what the reflections are, how rejoinings work, and what was lost each time one succeeded. Then, once that groundwork is in place, we're going to talk a bit about why this matters now, the damaged shards that remain, the problem of travel, and the looming possibility that the world may be facing a new version of the same question the Ascians once answered in the worst possible way. Light spoilers at first, heavier current story spoilers later. So if you are, somehow, here for a simple explanation of reflections, congratulations, and or condolences! I'm Elio Forturon, and I tend to go a little overboard on context. With that all said, let's begin. Around 12,000 years ago from the perspective of the Source, Hydaelyn sundered the star Atheris into the Source and its 13 reflections. The reasons for those actions are made clear in Endwalker, so we'll forgo it for now. Suffice it to say that it was well motivated. Once sundered, the Source and its 13 reflections were separated by a dimensional barrier, but they were not entirely cut off from one another. Each reflection remained ethereologically tied back to the Source, with a natural flow leading from reflection to Source, but not from reflection to reflection. So while each shard became its own world, its fate was still bound to the fate of the Source. If the Source falls, so do all the reflections. All 14 of these celestial bodies exist in the same space within the Sea of Stars, but dimensionally shifted from one another. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but think of the Source and the reflections like etheric radio frequencies. The Source is one station you could be tuned to, the first is another, the 13th another, and so on. They're not separated like planets across normal space. They're all present within the same room of existence, but each shard is vibrating on its own frequency. Unless you have some method of shifting or tuning into another frequency, you're stuck on the station you're already on. The radio does not create the station when you turn the dial, the signal was already there, occupying the same air as every other station. Tuning the frequency only decides which one becomes audible. The Source and the reflections work the same way. The other shards are not absent from the space you are standing in, they're overlapping it, but out of sync with you. So changing frequency does not move you across distance, it changes which version of the same rough occupied space you can exist within. This is why, broadly speaking, when you cross the barrier between Source and reflections, you end up in roughly the same area you started in, like Mordona to Lakeland or from one moon to another. And that matters because a rejoining is not a journey from one world to another in a traditional sense. It's not one planet crashing into another. It is one frequency of reality being reduced back into raw aether and forced into the Source. In the time directly after the Sundering, the reflections all shared the same broad foundation, the same world divided into 14, with mirrored geography, peoples, flora, fauna, and it seems each having remnants of the world unsundered. Each reflection was also given their own moon, something that did not exist in the world unsundered, with each housing a sundered fragment of Zodiark. The first souls upon these newly formed reflections were sundered shards of the ancients, and of the living creatures that had once existed on Atheris, but they were now 1/14 of what they had been. New bodies ensouled and splintered across the reflections, with some matching dispositions to who they once were, but without memory of their former lives. From there, they would live new and different lives, becoming people all their own. They would die and their souls return to the ethereal sea, and then those souls would go on again to find new lives in new bodies. These ancient souls are the ones that are able to acquire the Echo. But not everyone is an inheritor of an ancient soul. Over time, new souls and new peoples would be born, still sundered in density, but their souls no longer direct fragments of the world of the ancients. From that one shared starting point, the reflections began to diverge. They were born from the same world, but they did not remain copies of it. At some point after the Sundering, roughly 12,000 years ago, the dark convocation known as the Ascians, once discovering a means to travel between worlds, began their work that they called the Ardor, an effort to restore the world as it once was, free Zodiark, and rejoin the reflections back into the source as one united star. But that word, restore, is doing a lot of work. Because for the Ascians, this was restoration, a return to paradise. For everyone living on those shards, it was annihilation, because a rejoining does not preserve a reflection. It does not bring its people home. It converts an entire world, its lands, its beings, its history and culture, its living and dead and its unborn futures, into aether, and pours it back into the source in a planet-scale genocide and erasure. This is the reality of a rejoining. The Ascian Plan was simple and abstract. Dimensionally compress the reflections and rejoin them, undoing the sundering in the process. The correct methodology of doing so, however, was less clear to them. Their first attempt went awry due to a fundamental lack of understanding. They attempted to tilt one of the reflections towards darkness, which, again, to oversimplify a bit, is for all practical purposes the same as tilting it towards astrality, the polarity of change. Darkness is inherently astral, while light is inherently umbral, and many cultures even use the terms almost as different names for the same underlying concepts. The key thing to remember is this: light and umbrality are passive, while darkness and astrality are active. The Ascian error was in misunderstanding that not only did the reflections need to be tipped towards an ethereal imbalance, but the source must also be prepared to accept that surge of aether which would result. A rejoining requires two disasters to happen together, and thus the process requires coordination, because apparently one apocalypse is not enough. First, a reflection has to be pushed into overwhelming ethereal imbalance. That imbalance might be elemental, like wind, lightning, fire, earth, ice, or water, or it might be polar, like darkness and astrality, or light and umbrality. Those high energies naturally will spill over, and by means of the natural connection between the source and the reflections, flow towards the natural lower energy state on the source, like water flowing downhill, and those elements affect the source based on what they are. If the element in question were lightning, one would expect storm clouds of huge levin bolts to blot out the sky and rain constant surging destruction upon the land. If it were ice, one might expect the weather to turn bitterly cold, the land to be covered in frost, and life to freeze in its tracks. Like living in Minnesota. As aether continues to pour in from the reflection being tilted in a direction, such phenomena will become more and more extreme, until eventually a critical threshold is reached. That is where the second disaster is required. The source has to be made ready to receive the energies, needing its own catastrophe, something violent enough and aligned enough to crack the barrier between worlds. What was once a trickle becomes a deluge, the shard converted into raw aether and swept into the source, along with everything it once was. At the same time, the element that held sway in the shard is unleashed in full, its energies amplifying the planned disaster on the source to catastrophic proportions. An ancient primal of destruction unleashed from its many thousand-year imprisonment, bolstered by a wave of astral energies, or a simple poison that stills the aether of anyone who breathes it, made exponentially more potent and capable of blanketing entire nations. These devastating events are what are referred to as umbral calamities. However, if one of the reflections is tipped towards an element or polarity, but the source itself is not made ready, there are issues. Without that second piece, the momentary crack in the veil between source and reflection will not form, and once the reflection hits its critical point, it will suffer a flood of those energies, the reflection unconverted to aether or rejoined, and so instead it is left sitting in a state of devastation. A world left broken instead of erased, clinging to what damaged form of life it now can sustain. This was the fate of the 13th reflection and its flood of darkness.
This is where I belong, my home, this endless darkness you call the void. There was once light here, and it shone its warmth upon creation. The lands were green and the seas were blue. Life flourished. Before the war, the Contra Memoria. It shattered the balance, causing darkness to engulf the world. All life was transformed into monstrosities, void-sent. We are the natural order now. The sun was driven from the sky as fleeting day yielded to endless night. In time, even land and sea lost their distinction. And though the spark of reason had died in us, driven by memory's shadow, we formed factions and carved out domains.
Roughly 2,000 years after the Sundering, so 10,000 years ago from the Source's perspective, the 13th Reflection was a world not unlike the Source, with its own nations and heroes. The couple millennia of its history had given its people time to develop societies and cultures that flourished in their own ways. But this is where the Ascian attempted their first rejoining, tilting the energies of the world towards darkness, and thus the pole of astrality, by manipulating its heroes and villains both, tilting the star more and more towards darkness both figurative and literal. This attempt, however, failed spectacularly, due to not preparing the Source to accept the Aether and crack the veil between the two. The flood of darkness that washed over the 13th ruined it completely, causing its people to become horrifying creatures that we call voidsent, its lands to rend apart, and its very ethereal sea to become so astral and active that it could not maintain a fixed state, allowing Aether and souls no place to return to. It became a void of darkness, and would go by that name thereafter. And that is the state the 13th was left in for 10,000 years. After that failure, the Ascians would learn from their mistakes, moving on to their next attempt and leaving the void to be a problem they would deal with in the future. Shortly after, though, their successes would begin.
Here, time flows at a different pace from that of the Source. In the space of a single hour in your home world, an entire year might pass in the first, and the reverse could also be true. The pace fluctuates without rhyme or reason, and it cannot be predicted. That said, we seem to be entering a period of near equivalence, and thus, for the moment, you need not overly concern yourself with the passage of time.
Though time flows differently between reflections in a local sense, it seems that on a long enough timeline, they are roughly in sync. And more importantly, that when they are linked more directly, they come into at least some form of parity. So while there may or may not be directly equivalent amount of time that has passed on a reflection compared to the Source, on a long enough timescale, they do seem to be fairly close, or at least as long as there is some sort of crack in the barrier that is connecting them, like void fissures. With that in mind, somewhere roughly between 10 and 6,000 years ago, the first 3 rejoinings took place, with little documentation about what preceded them, beyond the devastation that they wrought. This next part is unavoidably going to be a lot of numbers, but the specificity of it is not what's important, so if your eyes glaze over a little bit at all the digits, don't worry, it's fine. The first successful rejoining happened when the 5th reflection was tilted towards wind, and rejoined in the first umbral calamity. The 12th reflection by being tilted towards lightning, which had nothing to do with the 9th reflection and its fate, preceding it by thousands of years and being a wholly unrelated reflection. But, at some time after that, the 2nd reflection was rejoined by tilting it towards fire, causing the 3rd umbral calamity. 5,000 years ago, when history truly becomes well documented, is when the 3rd reflection was rejoined to the Source, with the element of earth, and the tool used to help bring about its moment of rejoining was Syracuse Tower, pulling in the Aether of Dalamud, before it was redirected into the ground beneath it, resulting in the sinking of the Crystal Tower and the end of Alag, as well as earthquakes that caused mass devastation across the world, even as far away as Ilsabard. Then, 3,000 years ago, there was the 5th rejoining, which was the 6th reflection being tilted towards the element of ice, resulting in the 5th umbral calamity and the Age of Endless Frost upon the Source. It was from this that the Lalafell the South Sea Isles fled, praying to a crystal that led them to safety. After that, the 10th reflection was rejoined from the sins of the Ascians, tilting it to the element of water. The War of the Magi acting as an instrument on the Source to fracture the wall between Source and Reflection, and its tidal swells swallowed more than one civilization, and its rains and floods may have been seen as far away as Tyrol. Lastly was the 7th rejoining, where the 7th reflection had been tilted towards the pole of astrality, and Bahamut's release from Dalamud and resulting hellfire acting as the calamitous break between worlds to draw the 7th's energy back into the Source. These are the 7 rejoinings. 7 times have reflections been lost. Everything that they once were or could be, every story that they might have told or journey taken, forever gone. So, where does that leave us now? 7 worlds are gone, and 7 still exist. The Source and 6 surviving reflections. The 1st, 4th, 8th, 9th, 11th, and 13th. But surviving does not mean whole. The first survived a flood of light. The 13th was consumed by a flood of darkness. The 9th had been devastated by lightning, and the 4th appears to have suffered a great freezing. And the 8th and 11th remain largely unknown, though current implications point towards wind and earth having some role in their condition. And from here on, the conversation will be full spoilers up to the current point of MSQ, which as of this date is patch 7.5. Of the 7 that remain, we know that 4 are damaged. The first continuing to sit on the edge of being swallowed by Umbrality, having suffered the flood of light due to Metron and Logriff, and what happened with the creation of Eden that led to the failed 8th rejoining. And is even on its way to repair thanks to us bringing it back from the brink, the very Sin Eater that threatened to ruin it, and fast friends from the void. Unlike the first, the 13th was completely lost to the flood of darkness, and its void-sent denizens have for the most part gone mad. But it now has its own champions, striving to find a way to undo the damage done by the Ascians, as well as unite what people they can in that effort. The other 2 cases we know for sure are more complicated, as they have been damaged by elemental, not polarity-driven aether, and the ramifications of those effects may or may not be the same as umbral and astral damage. The first one we have is the 9th, which seems to have fully fallen to 11 after the storm surge. It's not clear if it can be counted as existing in a state like the 13th, that fully cannot be rejoined until repaired, or if it's like the first and still sits on the brink, where a sufficiently tilting event could still cause its rejoining. On the Mist Continent, some people remain, like those of Treno, but most life on the surface has either been blasted away or corrupted, and the only life that hasn't is specifically holding out via wards. While we do not know if the rise in lightning aether was the product of chance or Ascian machination, it's most likely the latter. In the wake of the death of Zodiark, it's more than likely that many planned rejoining schemes already in process were left to run their own course, with none of the sundered Ascians to oversee them. The 9th may have been a casualty, and it's also possibly what befell the most recent addition to the reflections we know something about. The 4th, which has at least in large part fallen to ice. Its lands below the clouds frozen solid, while its peoples fled to the skies via powerful magics. It would not be the first time we have seen a reflection whose surface was devastated while its skies were mostly calm. Living Memory exists peacefully on top of the cloud cover above the 9th in a similar fashion. And 11th, we do not know their fates, but due to the events of Interphos, where we see projected representations of the reflections, of which one is wind, one is earth, and in the extreme, one is ice, it's heavily implied that they may also be suffering like the 9th and 4th, but to wind and earth, though we do not know which would be which. It is important to remember what that means. These remaining reflections are not just open plot threads or damaged zones on a cosmic map. They are still worlds. Some are wounded, some may be barely holding together. Some we know almost nothing about. But whatever life remains, there are still people waking up under their own skies, still nations trying to endure, and still futures that have not yet been effaced from the canvas of creation.
Our success has also served to solidify our understanding of cross-rift travel. The Ascians rejoined reflections to the source by instigating elemental imbalances. These imbalances weakened the barrier between realities, causing the ether of a reflection to flood the source. But why is it that reflections are predisposed to rejoin the source? Why have they never merged with one another?
Thou art suggesting there is a unique property inherent to the source, one responsible for such an outcome.
I am. 'Tis my conclusion that, as the point of origin for the reflections, the source has an innate pull over them. Hydaelyn, I believe, sought to suppress that pull, which is why she was created with the power of light, of stasis. Meanwhile, the power of darkness, of activity, reigns in the void. Hydaelyn's influence would naturally be weaker, and this manifested in the form of planar fissures. Working with this hypothesis, I set my sights upon where the pull was assessed to be strongest, and through our combined efforts, we succeeded in opening a gate to the void. Now, I must stress, it was because we sought the void that we succeeded. Pleased though I am to have my theory proven, the secrets of travel to other reflections still elude us. Even so, in the reality that lies beyond the 8th umbral calamity,
There are those who found a way to reach the first. I will not rest until I do the same.
Now, even though the reflections overlap in the same space, travel between them is still exceptionally difficult. Sharing a location is not the same thing as sharing access. That difficulty matters. If one of these worlds began to fail, help cannot simply arrive. People cannot simply flee to another shard. Even when the worlds overlap, they remain sealed away from one another. Only recently has this even taken the first steps towards changing in a meaningful way. When it comes to difficult travel, the major exception is the 13th's darkness, and thus its exceptionally high astrality, seems to act as a weakening agent against the veil separating reflections. That instability is responsible for the void fissures that, naturally, form on the source. Tears in the barrier between worlds that can be widened into full gates or closed. In simple terms, imagine the astrality of the 13th causing the barrier between source and void to vibrate so violently it can rip a hole in the barrier between dimensions. This may be especially relevant because the stability of the natural wall between reflections and source, or at least the prevention of damage to that wall, may be in part tied to Hydaelyn and her domain over light and umbrality. And this does not only apply to the source. We have also seen forcible arcane gates between the 13th and the 1st, such as the Hollows, and what we witness in the events of the Pilgrim's Traverse. This is also why, even though the reflections all share the same space, as it were, one cannot simply fly out into the sea of stars and cross into another shard. We do not yet know exactly what would happen if someone from a reflection traveled beyond their moon, but going back to the radio analogy, the safest assumption is that they would remain tuned to the dimensional plane they started from. Now, while the methods of travel may differ, whether it is including, though not limited to, the magic that brought the Warrior of Light to the First, void gates leading to the 13th, or the Ascians moving between worlds, the actual passage between reflections always involve the interdimensional rift. The rift is a exceptionally complicated topic, but the fundamental point is this. It is an infinite possibility corridor that sits between dimensions, and between parts of time and space that otherwise cannot normally touch. It is by means of the rift that we have entered the First, reached the 13th, returned in time onto Elpis, and taken part in a host of other strange journeys. I'm looking at you, Nier. Its existence is not the unknown part. The Ascians used it to travel and hide. Omega used it as a space hidden away from the world to rest and prepare, and even characters like Surrealjaw have glimpsed other worlds through it, inspiring electrope-augmented magical creations. The problem is not that nobody has heard of the Rift. The problem is that the Rift is, technically speaking, a nightmare hallway made of dimensional aetherology, and is extraordinarily difficult to use and manipulate intentionally. Crossing worlds is possible. Doing so reliably, safely, and with purpose is another matter entirely. And that brings us to the magics of Azem. The Crystal of Office crafted by Emmett Selk and imbued with the magic of his friend has allowed us to call on the aid of others through time and space again and again. And now we are inheritors not only of the seat and crystal, but of ethos, a power of an exceptional scale, and one that, in color, symbol, function, and temperament, seems to fully embody the person who likely created it. Ethos manifests a golden-orange gate of the sun, a power that connects people and places between worlds, though its rhyme and reason are still not fully understood. Those who try to control it only ever seem to find limited success, its very existence is seemingly tied to inexorable fate. At its heart, it is meant as a relic of connection. Connection without conquest, without consumption, and without reducing one world into fuel for another, and of adventures unending. But its power has also been bent towards darker ends. It saved the Malala of the South Sea Isles from the Fifth Umbral Calamity, but it was later used by preservation to create the Gate of Remembrance, and intended as a means to steal living aether throughout the reflections. And then, when forced by the Endless Fiend, it was made to merge a piece of the Ninth Reflection with the Source. But unlike in Ascian Rejoining, where the reflection is first converted into aether and then poured back into the Source, this was a physical merging. The two worlds were forced into the same space at once. And while it did not outright kill most of the people caught within it, it caused immense devastation to flora, fauna, and the land itself, irrevocably altering the ethereal ley lines of the region. Yasulani will never be the same. Using ethos this way does not seem to be its intended design. From documentation by preservation, it even seems to resist that use, and still forcing it to, without causing mass devastation, seems nearly impossible. to say nothing of the ethereal fuckery, trademark, it may cause long-term. And that leads us to the current threat. Something I and many others had been wondering about long before it ever became explicit. The Solstice. Zodiark, a being of immense astrality, was created to quicken the ethereal ley lines of the star, protecting it from the Song of Oblivion and invigorating all life upon it. Hydaelyn was made in opposition to that astrality. She was created to sunder the world, to stop the ancients from sacrificing innocent life, and to make possible a mankind that could endure and answer the Song of Oblivion. And implicit through her great umbrality, she also maintained the divide between worlds. Together, Zodiark and Hydaelyn held the reflections in balance. But Zodiark is gone. His aether held within the moons has returned to each star's ethereal sea, save the 13th, where there was no sea to return to. Hydaelyn, too, has returned to the sea, her soul fully breaking into ambient aether and allowed to become part of the Great Flow once more, hopefully one day forming new souls to seek adventure. And with both gone, there seems to no longer be a power keeping the causality of nature from returning to its normal course. That is the fear of the Solstice, the forcible rejoining of all reflections into one. Unlike the Ascian Plan, however, this would not be a controlled rejoining. It would be something more primordial. Not restoration, just devastation. All life, source and reflections alike, turned into a titanic, astronomical coalescing of aether. Everything reduced to its constituent, ethereal components and wiped clean, so that nothing remains but the star beginning its million-year course towards life all over again. This is something many had speculated on long before it became clear. The lore and aetherology suggested it was possible, but it was never clear whether there was some other force that might keep the reflections and source in equilibrium. The reality, however, is that in these newly godless realms, we must find our own way. As the barrier between the reflections weaken, travel between them may become easier. Thanks to the converging of reflections, we're already seeing void tears open with greater regularity. Whether that will affect other methods of travel, or the use of ethos itself, remains uncertain. What is clear, though, is that the choice will have to be made about how to handle the looming solstice. The Winterers would, for new reasons, return to the logic of the Ascians. Not to restore the world unsundered, not out of loyalty to Zodiark or for the same reasons as the ancients, but to sacrifice the few to save the many. To rejoin the reflections, murder everything upon them, person, plant, and animal, so that at least the source might survive. The danger of the Winterers is not that they want the same thing as the Ascians. They don't. The danger is that they will use necessity as the foundation for cruel action. That they will ignore the chance for a better way, for the certainty of sacrifice. And, even then, the source would not be spared. A rejoining still requires a calamity, so to save the source, they would first have to wound it badly enough to make it capable of receiving the reflection. Something that would require the deaths of countless lives. Though it could be that the current weakening of the barrier that's taking place may allow the skipping of that step. Perhaps there are other ways, though. If the reflections are already tethered to the source, maybe they can be stabilized. Maybe the remaining 7 worlds can share their aether in a great cycle, or in some new form of nature, an ethereal sea that flows between them, rather than one that demands that they collapse into one another. The 7 united onto one, rather than into one. For now, though, who can say? Maybe you in the future. But this is why reflections matter. They're not just distant shards of old lore, they're worlds full of people with their own joys and sorrows, their own past, presents, and hopefully futures. And the question for now is whether those futures can be saved without erasing them. Stay safe, Archons, and thanks for watching.